We need a policy body for the arts in this country. I would try to pour that into a policy think tank with a lobbying arm, with an advocacy arm, with a marketing arm. When we founded the Arts Funders Forum in 2017, it was in response to then President Trump's inauguration and his announcement that he was going to abolish the NEA. And so the question became, if public funding for the arts goes away, is there a mechanism to spur more private giving to the arts, especially in the context of this largest intergenerational wealth transfer that's ever happened? And we looked around the room and we acknowledged the amazing work of Americans for the Arts, grant makers for the arts. And we thought, is there space there to specifically target and do research in and discuss the potential of next gen giving? So we created the Arts Funders Forum.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the MO Podcast, where we interview change makers who are building big and ambitious projects in the art and cultural sector. My name is Joey Flores, and I'm here with my co-host, Jonathan Neal. Today, we have a special interview with the arts leader who actually introduced me to Jonathan 3.5 years ago. Melissa Cowley-Wolf is an accomplished strategist and advisor with over 2 decades of experience in philanthropy, cultural institutions, and leadership coaching. She's the founder of MCW Projects, a firm that integrates organizational wellness, philanthropic strategy, and executive coaching, particularly for arts and museum leaders. Melissa has worked on campaigns totaling up to $4 billion and has been recognized by ArtNet as a global innovator transforming the art industry. Her most notable initiative is the Arts Funders Forum, a platform aimed at increasing private support for the arts by reimagining cultural philanthropy. Through this forum, she's been leading important conversations about engaging the next generation of art patrons and philanthropists. These discussions often address critical issues such as ethical philanthropy, the role of the arts in social justice, and how cultural organizations can pivot to be more impactful and sustainable. Recently, Melissa rolled out an executive coaching program tailored to museums and arts organization CEOs and chief development officers. Her coaching incorporates wellness and somatic practices and complements her broader involvement in strategic planning, board development, and philanthropic advising for arts institutions. Melissa, welcome to the show.
Thank you guys so much for having me. This is such a pleasure to be with the two of you.
Yeah, I'm excited to reconnect. You played a huge role in us even being here on this podcast. So, here we are.
Well, it was really fun and seemed only natural to introduce the two of you. So I'm glad it worked. I love it when that happens. That's why I like bringing people together.
Yeah, quite amazing. Melissa, you've been in arts advocacy for a long time with MCW Projects, the Art Funders Forum, your current coaching approach. How would you describe your personal mission, and what do you think is your superpower?
Goodness, wow. You're starting small, starting with a very small question, huh? Very easy, small question. Well, thank you for that lovely introduction. And, this is, I think, like many of us, I've only ever worked in this field. I took to go way back and be cliche, I took an art history class in high school that my mother made me take because she was an art teacher, an art historian, and didn't want to do it, but did it. And it kind of opened an interesting path, and ended up majoring it in college after changing my major, and realized I wanted to go into museum work because of the public facing aspect of it, because of what I perceived as a kind of a dialogue with the public, but also with the urban fabric. And this was, right at the turn of the century, and the Bilbao effect was raging. So I was particularly interested in, were these new buildings going to cultivate new audiences? So that was kind of the seed of thinking about expanding audience engagement, and eventually found my way into philanthropy and spent 15 years as a development officer and chief development officer. And, now that you ask the question, I think the through line for me, given what I'm interested in and what I feel most comfortable with, which I guess could be a superpower, is being able to connect with folks across the spectrum of society, regardless of their profession, about the arts and why they matter. And I fundraised for both arts museums, and also institutions of higher ed, cultural and art schools. So Art Institute of Chicago, Columbia's architecture school. And I always felt that art and education could get you into any room and any conversation, right? They are just a hook. You can direct any conversation to that way. Everyone has an interest in it. Everyone has connected with it. I think my interest in and my passion for talking to people and listening to them and having conversation and finding common ground is kind of leads me into a place where I can make a case or want to make a case for why the arts matter, and then being able to break down how our art sector is funded, the different components of it, right? Because there is and I'm sure we'll talk about this, a huge lack of understanding about one, the nonprofit model, and we see that from data and research, to the philanthropic model, and therefore the museum and arts organization model, that it is not entirely funded by the government, that it is not a corporate entity, a lot of opaqueness, a lack of understanding about what the nonprofit business model is, how is a philanthropic industry. And, in conversations with people, being able to break that down and bring about a little bit of kind of common ground and understanding of why these institutions matter, why the arts matter, why our artists matter. And therefore, once you have that knowledge and understanding and education, you're one step closer to getting involved or supporting these institutions. So I really feel like we need to do work on clarifying what our industry is. And I think that's something I enjoy doing and I'm passionate about. And I think, I've seen a little bit of success with.
What in your conversations with arts leaders, development officers, this is sort of without going into any individual conversation, right now, what are people feeling? And what are they telling you that their biggest challenges are? They're sort of like 1, 2, and 3 challenges are. And that's different from asking what their priorities are, because I think we have a good idea about understanding what their priorities are related to the missions of their organizations and things like that. And obviously, if you're a chief development officer, your priority is to be able to raise those funds. But what are they feeling right now in terms of what the job is, how it's changed, and what challenges they're facing in the roles?
That's a great question. The commonality I see is, and I think this could become more clear in the next year, but we're in this in between, right, where we just experienced this once in a century pandemic. We have experienced a swelling of social movements, calls for social, racial, climate justice. We've seen this acceleration of technology, especially in the last couple of years since COVID. COVID, it's cliche to say, but COVID accelerated everything, right? Including the pace of life now. It's just wild. So I think people are recognizing that, like, whoa, things are different, but we don't necessarily know how they're different, and therefore not necessarily sure the best way forward. And the optimistic view on that is it can allow for experimentation, but that experimentation can get tempered, can kind of get stuck with the funding issue that we're having as a sector. So, I say this as someone that's inherently optimistic, but I think we're in a very, very bizarre time. I think everyone feels that. The staffs of institutions are frankly pretty exhausted. I think everyone's exhausted to get into the somatic practice here. I think we're all living kind of through this trauma and in a trauma response. We kind of felt like we got over the hump of COVID, and then boom, we're in this extremely polarizing presidential election that is in many ways unprecedented and will have significant, regardless of where it goes, a significant, impact on the future of our country and the world, and the art sector, which we can talk about. So I think, like to say, acknowledging the problem is the first step, right? I think arts leaders are seeing this. They're like, okay, things are funky. Things are just funky. Our numbers are up and down. Sometimes, we come close to meeting audience numbers of people coming back after the pandemic. We haven't gotten there yet, but we know our peers across town have gotten there. We're having to kind of revitalize our board, but they're doing great. So there's it's all over the place. And I think people feel that. And the work that I really enjoy doing with these leaders is like, okay, let's stop. Let's acknowledge what's going on. Let's make sure you as the leader are, grounded and present and can see clearly what is going on, and therefore can shape your vision of where you want to go. And you can co-regulate the organization with the staff, the teams, and the board, so that you can, from that, grounded, present, aware place, make that strategy. And that strategy is more important than ever. Strategic planning, more important than ever, right? And I like to work in a collaborative way and have these strategic planning processes be consensus built. So the board, the stakeholders, and the staff are all there together, working on this, laying the groundwork and articulating this plan together. Because you got to be fully in alignment as an organization to move forward, given all the headwinds that we're facing. So I see a lot of acknowledgement, and therefore that's why people are reaching out to say, you know, I need a partner to craft my leadership strategy. I need a partner to think through how can I evolve this institution on a staff level, on a board level, and therefore on a philanthropic level. What's our relationship with the community? Really, what is the 21st Century Museum? And so I see really a new generation of leaders coming into these roles who get that things have shifted and a new way forward is not only necessary but possible, and who really want to do the work as individual leaders and as collective organizations to determine what that new institution for the 21st century should be. But I think, you know, to simply bullet it, there's an awareness things are nuts. That things could get a lot more nuts. There is a malaise and an exhaustion with teams and staff. So we're seeing a lot of change. You're seeing a lot of director development jobs open at institutions across the country. People shifting in this post-COVID time to what do they really want to do, moving to Mexico or across the country or wherever, you know, they want to go. So, but I am really impressed with especially this new generation of leadership, that they are going to invest in this work. And not just, you know, put a Band-Aid on a problem and move forward. They really want to dig in and figure out the best way forward for the organization and the team and therefore the community, because that's ultimately who these organizations serve, right? They serve these communities. And I see a lot of leaders also bringing it back to that.
It's interesting because shouldn't this be, in some respects, a golden age for these nonprofit institutions, given the great wealth transfer conversation that has been going on for a decade, where everyone has been saying, just wait for it. There's trillions of dollars getting ready to change hands from the estates of these baby boomers and all this captured wealth that's heading down towards the next generation, and to avoid taxes and to take part in effective estate planning, there is going to be a huge sluice of money just like flowing into the coffers of all of these various different organizations and institutions. But it certainly doesn't seem like, even though we're at the sort of front end of that generational transfer, it does not seem like the development offices, the leadership of a lot of these institutions are feeling like things are part of some sort of golden age of the great transition, the great wealth transfer. What are your thoughts on how that is taking shape, at least in the present? Was that all overhyped to a certain extent? Not in terms of the scope of the money, but just where that money would end up going to, as if it was de facto going to land in the pockets of these large philanthropic institutions? Or is it just hasn't happened yet? We're at the front edge, and post-COVID, and with all the other things that are in the world, we're just not in a place to sort of see the benefits of this great wealth transfer that people have been talking about for more than a decade.
That's a great question, and that's the crux of it, right? I mean, as we said, our industry, the institutional side, the nonprofit side, is a philanthropic business model. So without that money, we can't do anything. So, you know, I think, you know, money is nothing without people moving it around, right? It's just, it's you know, it takes the person to direct the money for there to be a difference. So I always think about it as, let's look at what's going on behind the money. Right? So yes, you have this huge pot of money. The most amount of money that has ever been transferred is about to be transferred from one generation to another. There's different numbers floating around. I like 60 trillion, upwards of 60 trillion, which is just inconceivable, right? We know from a study that was done a few years ago by Wealth Engine and Coldwell Banker that there are over 500,000 millennial millionaires, half over 500,000 millennial millionaires. It's a lot to say, so I'll say it twice, in the US, and their wealth is expected to increase by 5% by the end of this decade. So that's all in process. This is all in process. And we're talking about two different things, right? We're talking about wealth that is inherited with that number, yes. But then there's also the first time millionaires and billionaires, the self-made wealth, the new wealth creators, right? So you have this money sloshing around across people from a very, very broad spectrum. So while we have all this money floating around, which could make quite a difference in our sector, and can get to that in a second, you have a different attitude, right? We've mentioned a few times, I talked about next generation leadership just previously. You have rising generations, next gen, as gets thrown around that term, the next generations of who will be significant philanthropists who can make transformational change with their massive philanthropy and their massive wealth, should they choose, right? Just look at the world differently, right? And we've seen in the last year, I think, a lot of great resources come out that explain that, either from a political standpoint, a tech standpoint, where you have Jonathan Haidt with the anxious generation, you have all this, Richard Reeves, who talks about male loneliness and what is going on with younger men in American and global society. Just to name a few, you have these massive changes happening. So of course you're going to have generations who look at the world differently. And therefore, if they inherit or if they have made significant wealth, are going to want to solve problems and direct that wealth differently to solve those problems, right? So then you get to the crux of it, which is, do those rising generations view the arts with the same passion, the same urgency, national civic pride as the generation before them? And we know from various research studies, the answers are typically no, that there is just a difference, that there has been a disconnect from generation to generation on how the arts are viewed by society. There are a lot of reasons for that. We can talk about the lack of funding for arts education in public school systems. You can talk about STEM education. There's a lot of reasons for this. Where are Americans putting their money, their investment, the focus on business and tech versus the humanities? That is one part of it. Cultural trends, changing attitudes, consumerism, the rise of technology, everything, right? So what I find is really interesting is that when you dig in even deeper, we know from research that these incoming generations, by and large, and this is not everyone, but a majority we see from research studies, don't see how the arts are adding value to society or are driving the areas of global progress that they most want to see, namely racial, social, and climate justice, right? So I think the task at hand for all of us, and I think this next generation of leaders feels this very, very heavily and understands it. And that's why talking about the data and learning the data is so crucial, because we have all this data. There's data being churned out every day from various organizations, from Edelman, Caldwell Banker I referenced, the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy based out of Indiana is fantastic. And stuff that we've done with the Arts Funders Forum shows that clearly the arts sector needs a new message on how are we adding value to society? How are the arts creating impact and driving impact in these areas of our biggest global challenges? What does social impact even mean now, right? And how do the arts, a sector that has typically and historically had trouble quantifying their impact on society, how can we quantify that, right? And a lot of that comes from listening to our audiences, right? Which is a key component of the work that I do is, are you listening to your audiences? Are you listening to what they want you to be, how you can serve your community, instead of just saying, well, we've done it this way and we're just going to churn this out. And this is what you need to know about this artist. And this is what you need to know about museums. Are you actually going through the process of listening? And that component is so crucial to shaping what that 21st century museum will be. And if you listen to and connect with and have those conversations with your audiences, you will hear what is needed. And you will also hear what people want to invest their time, their energy, and their money in. And we're also talking about these rising generations who are, yes, they can philanthropically, financially support an institution, but you also see rising volunteer rates among Gen X. Gen X actually contributes more volunteer hours than any other generation we have right now, right? So they might not be giving as much money as the silent generation, the boomers, who are still supporting these institutions, by and large, but they're volunteering. And then we see with younger generations who are very, very politically engaged, socially engaged, really want to roll up their sleeves and co-author programs with institutions and partner with institutions to figure out how to drive impact in their communities, right? That they want to design programs based on their experience, based on their expertise with institutions. They really want to get involved. They want their voice to be heard. They want to be in dialogue. And that's just very different than what we've seen over the past few generations. And that's normal given where we are in this moment of history. The challenges, and you mentioned what is the role of the development teams. Yes, it's raising money, but why that job is so hard now and why there is a lot of staff shakeup and a lot of exhaustion, especially coming out of COVID, where your job was to keep these doors open, right? Is that you need to cultivate folks and your communities in a very nuanced way, right? There is this generational shift. So you really, again, going back to listening, you have to get to know your audiences, your communities, your prospects, your donors, and understand how they want to participate, how they want to help you and partner with you and invest in you to do the good work that you're doing to serve your communities. And we can't necessarily make assumptions, which is why the listening is so important, which is why nothing is going to beat a face-to-face, but you can't have a two-person development team meet with everyone in your city, right? But creating those opportunities where you can, surveying audiences and listening and figuring out different avenues and different entry points for different demographics and audiences. And it's so much work and it's really, really hard. But that's the moment that we're in, where the old models of everything aren't working anymore. And it's challenging for everyone in every industry, but it's particularly challenging in an industry that is reliant on philanthropic dollars.
Melissa, who are some organizations that you think are like knocking it out of the park right now and doing a really fantastic job of adjusting to this new environment? And what are some specific things that they're doing that are helping them win?
I'm working with the Oakland Museum of California right now, and I really love what they're doing around quantifying social impact, which is something I mentioned is notoriously hard for organizations, social arts organizations to do. For instance, if you're an educational institution, and I raised money for institutions of higher ed, you give this much money, we can give out this many scholarships. That's that many lives, 8, 9, 10, 50 lives that are going to be made better because they can go through, they don't have the financial capacity to, and they can now go through this educational process and come out with a degree without a loan to pay back, right? And it can expand the number of folks and the types of folks and communities who have access to something that is wildly expensive right now, right? You give to a medical institution, or you give to a study for a cure for a disease, and they cure the disease. My money cured the disease, right? That is incredibly impactful and quantifiable. It is harder in what we do, because I think that ultimately what we do is we're in the business of kind of evolving hearts and minds, right? We're in the business of what does it mean to be human, of getting people to question that so that they can then, move their lives in a direction that's in response to that, be more inquisitive. I mean, these sound very, very lofty things, which is why it's really hard to explain and quantify. There's a lot of other things that we do, but I happen to think at the heart of that, art is us, and therefore the understanding of it and the interpretation of it is so crucial, and it's exceptionally hard to quantify. I mentioned the Oakland Museum of California. They have really been working on on defining what social impact is, and those studies and extensive surveying of their audiences, from catching people on the way out the door to post-visitor studies. They have a great response rate to that. And they've defined social impact as fostering social cohesion. And I'm going to read this: increasing people's connectedness, their willingness to interact with one another and to take action together, valuing each other, getting to know each other, and enjoying being around each other. I don't know about you, but right now in 2024, that sounds really freaking great. Wouldn't that be a lovely thing? So how do you define social impact? And that's one way that they defined it, is how do you bring a diverse group together under one roof to be together around something that is maybe lovely and joyful, but also maybe incredibly complicated and difficult, but to do it with respect. So that's an interesting take on how do we define what social impact is. And that goes into what is that role of the civic institution. I love that they're exploring that. And they are a museum. If you look at their mission, they are not just an art museum, they are a history museum, history of the people of California. They are based in Oakland. And so, in listening to their community and then responding with their programming and the work that they do, is very much what organizations need to do. Like everyone else, these organizations, even though they're doing that work, they're setting their sights on that, they're understanding the data and they're internalizing it to then respond as an organization. We're just in this moment where you're going to see audience rates go up and down. You're going to see it go up and down. That's just the weird moment that we're in. The pandemic really changed a lot. But I love that they're doing it. And I think it's really important work. And it's looking at what the model is of our organization and how do we listen to and respond to communities and very clearly articulate what we're trying to do and the impact we make on society.
What is a response, to the extent that you're seeing it, to, let's say, an argument that says, particularly for arts organizations, in order to maintain their relevance or their interest on the part of donors and supporters, the arts themselves, the programs that are put on by the museums, need to align themselves with the various different justice movements that have become more front of mind for many people, especially since 2020, but I'd say over the last decade. Whether this is climate, social, racial, what have you, I think a lot of cultural institutions have heeded that call. There's been a lot of redirection, both on the part of artists as well as the part of the institutions themselves, to kind of make what they do somehow in the service of one of these domains. Now, there's an argument to be made that those cultural institutions are never going to be a primary mode of effectiveness in the campaigns for various different types of justice, various different types of work, right? There are other organizations, there are other activist groups, there are other campaigns that are straight up the middle when it comes to things like, just take climate as an example, right? And so arts and cultural organizations are always going to be kind of epiphenomenon of that activity, right? They're going to be consciousness raising, awareness raising, a continuation of those activities and other means. Is there an argument to be made, however, that means you're always already not number one in that space, right? You are always already, in some sense, a supplemental kind of activity to some larger mission-driven set of groups that are more straight up the middle, to which the money is always going to flow first. And so it's going to be a more difficult time for you to match up, the person who is like, I am mission-driven by climate, but I also like the arts. And so this seems like a good place that, I could park some of the capital or some of my time and attention and networks, rather than an alternative, which is, this is more from what we hear about in the startup community and the business community a lot. It's like, if you can't be number one in that space or see a path to being number one in that space, don't shoot for just being number two or number three or tertiary or supplemental. What is it in the arts and cultural space that you can be number one at, right? That you can be exceptional at, and find the people that are going to support that excellence and that exceptionality in its own lane, whatever that might be. So how do leaders, development people, organizations try and manage that? I don't want to call it yet a kind of contradiction, but it's a little bit of a acceptance, in a sense, that in order to, today, the orthodoxy seems to be, in order to sort of gain those donor dollars or gain that interest, we're always going to be trying to, get the secondary or tertiary interest from these other missions, versus having a more straight up the middle mission for what arts and culture actually means to a community to culture, to the history, state, whatever it is that you want to imagine that it is that you might be serving, but it might be something other than one of these other missions that are already being served by other organizations.
Well, that's what I love about you, Jonathan. You asked me that question and we could spend 3 hours on it. So the last thing you said, I think, is super important to start with, right? Museums and arts organizations, nonprofits, right? Why does a nonprofit exist? The nonprofit is filling a gap left open by the community and the corporate world, right? That's sort of where this NGO model, right? And these are mission-driven organizations, and they are going to attract mission-driven staff members and teams, right, to execute a mission. We're not in it for the big bucks. I would say, and so saying that, your question about how do we be number one at this thing, first of all, I think you have to be number one to the thing your community wants you to be number one at, which goes back to the listening, right? The talking to, the getting to know your audience. What do they need? Obviously it's got to fit within your mission. You're not going to go off and do something completely different, but listening to the community, first of all. So the number one thing, it is not, it's so dependent on where you are, what your mission is, and who the folks are that you're serving. And again, these organizations are serving a public and a community, right? The other thing is, you mentioned this, you talked about museum as activist, and without getting too political here, the question, does a museum need to be an activist to be relevant? Absolutely not. No. I think the pendulum has swung and back and forth over the last couple years. That's a whole nother conversation. But I think, and you don't have, this is not a cure-all, right? To every organization saying, oh, we know from research that rising generations care a lot about these issues, right? They came of age during the financial crisis, Occupy Wall Street, the end of the wars in the Middle East, another financial crisis. I mean, it goes on and on and on and on, right? So they are very focused on that by and large. Not everyone, but from data, we see a good portion. That does not mean that, okay, now every museum needs to become an activist museum, take a stance on every political thing that happens in the world. And if we just spend all of our time talking about social, racial, climate justice, we will raise millions of dollars. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. And this is where I think about, especially for contemporary art museums, and where I think we all connect, is letting the artists lead. Right? At the end of the day, what is in art museums? Artwork. Who makes the artwork? Artists, right? So are you listening to the artists too? What are artists creating right now? What is the messaging? What are the trends? What are we seeing? What work are they making and why? And right there, you can figure out how to create and position a program that that is going to touch upon these issues. Because right now, I think we would say a lot of contemporary art being made addresses the issues that are going on in society. It always has to some extent, but right now it seems very literal. And so paying attention to what artists are saying and what artists are doing, that can work for encyclopedic museums as well. Kind of tangential to that, I would love to get to DC to see the Impressionism show, because they're contextualizing it in a way that's, okay, yes, this is on every postcard you've ever seen, and we are numb to this artwork. But wait a second, let's go back. These people completely disrupted the art system in France and Europe as we know it, right? And they were just lambasted for it. But we forget that, right? So it's like, even though we start to live with this work and assimilate it into our lives, there was a statement there. Artists are responding to contemporary life in a way that makes sense to them, right? So letting the artists really lead that, and being an institution that is artist centric, I think will guide you on this path, right? But it is by no means a cure-all. And so the idea of a museum as an activist institution is exceedingly polarizing, right? Because the idea is that we are, again, going back to the Oakland Museum example, we want to create social cohesion. If that's what you want to do, then you want to be a space that's welcoming to everybody. And not everyone agrees on the way forward with the issues, the most pressing issues of our day, right? Which is why we have a very polarized country and a very polarized world. but how can you create awareness? How in line with your mission, responding to what the community says they want by being artist centric and letting artists lead that way and hosting that conversation in a way that is accessible, that is not intimidating. And I think if we follow the art, it opens us up to a lot of different conversations that can be extremely welcoming.
I mean, I could definitely come back on top of that, because I think, I mean, I agree with you. However, I think that there's a twofold problem there. One is, follow the artist, I think is, often great advice. But I also think it puts sort of like undue pressure on the artist to have an understanding, a way of working, or, puts them in this kind of specialized role where they become this fetishized object of being the seer or the channeler of the whatever the contemporary moment might be, or they become, again, some sort of proxy advocate for a kind of larger mission. And thus, Josh Klein at the Whitney, basically becomes the avatar of climate change, and corporate capture of human identity. And that is just like, whether the work itself becomes impossible to sort of for anybody to like think about as work within a larger history, because it just gets attached to this kind of narrative that people are interested in. So one, you can follow the artist that way. But two, the museums and these cultural institutions have a very significant role to play in terms of the logic of selection as curators, as people who are interested in shaping a kind of story, both for their communities and for their peers, and for whatever sort of larger mission or culture they imagine themselves serving. And so, follow the artist is one thing, but you got to make a choice about which artists you follow and which ones you're deciding to put forward. You've only got so many square feet. You've only got so many days in the year. You've only got so many opportunities for people to be engaged. And so, by definition, it's a zero-sum game. You've got to exclude some while you are putting in others. So, I think that is, while it is always a sort of, I think part of the mission is very good advice, there is a sense that the institutions, the leadership, the curatorial staff, the development staff, I think more and more importantly, the educational staff of these institutions are, have to be making choices, like you said, in their strategic planning process. What is our goal? What are, how do we define ourselves? What is our mission? What is the specificity of it? And then how does everything flow from that? That, I think about strategic planning process, so necessary, so exhausting, often things that happen and create these 5-year plans and get shoved in a drawer, because then it's like, oh, this like meta process that we have to go through as an institution kind of goes by the wayside. Even just talking about
Not
it
the
makes
way I do it. We don't
want to
put
go
them
take a
in the
nap.
drawer. We make it
Yeah,
fun.
I'm sure. I know. But, I think that part of this is sort of, I don't know if I've got a sort of specific question coming out of this, except just to push back a little bit on this sense that, also too, like the response to communities, again, I totally agree. Part of that is about defining who your community is and how, what it looks like, and who you imagine yourself answering to. Some organizations, if you take, given their size, have very different idea about who they are serving and what their communities are, versus I imagine like the Oakland Museum of California has a much more specific idea about who it is that they are serving, and what it is that what it is that their mission is about, and how it is that serves those constituencies. But it's sort of like the museum as an entity, the cultural institution as an entity, and their leadership also need to lead, right? They also have to be out front. They also have to take a position, and not to make everything, back to a kind of startup environment, but it's like, Steve Jobs, in this kind of paternalistic and maybe arrogant way, once said that, the public doesn't know what it wants, right? Like the consumer doesn't know what they want until we show it to them, right? And it takes a sort of like, asshole genius to do that every once in a while. But I do think that part of what may be missing within the the museum environment, the cultural environment is a little bit of that sort of, the will to try and take a risk, which says, this is what we are going to do, right? This is what our mission is. It is serving this community. It is serving this constituency. It is serving this mission, even if it might not be the first thing that community, that constituency recognizes off the face of it, right? We're going to give them something that they haven't asked for or haven't seen before, but we're going to stick our necks out a little bit and do something a little bit different from what everybody else is doing.
Mm-hmm. I like, and to clarify too, and I like you pushing back is, let's be careful to fetishize the artist and see it as a seer, see the artist as a seer. And I'm not advocating for deifying our artists, right? And I think that is quite problematic. But kind of the tone and the texture and I know this is a big word in this time in 2024, the vibe election, the vibe coming out of what is being made, right?
Well, that's all you get. It's all vibes.
Yeah, it's all vibes. It's not
vibes. Policy.
That's a whole other podcast. And what you're talking about, the curatorial role and the institution's role, right, is shaping that story, is contextualizing that story. And in that contextualization can be that risk, right? And I like that you said that museums need to leave. Now, there's a difference between shoving stuff down people's throats. You need to know this, and here's why, and this is our political position on it. And making risk, I think there should be an element to risk for everything, right? And we're a risk adverse industry. I like to say that an industry that's about creativity is one of the least creative industries on the planet. And we're very risk averse because it's scary, right? Because we are dependent on these philanthropic dollars for people agreeing with us and investing with us. They don't need our product. They don't need it. It's because they want it and connect with it and think it will make their communities better, right? So there's a lot of aversion to that, to pissing people off and making people upset and turning people away. And that I hear it. I've participated in it. I hear it. We all hear it. If we do this, we're going to lose this donor. They're not going to like it. Okay, what is the, how do we want to assess that risk, right? Is this something we need to do and it's worth it, or that's the money business, right? That's the money business. So not shoving it down the throats, but I think the part that you're saying is the leading, and that's why I'll push back on that strategic planning, which I've been a part of that too. You finish it, you spend a lot of money, you throw it in a drawer. That was a waste of time. And when I started working on my own, it was like, I am not going to be that. I'm not going to add to that waste. I want to add to something that is based in dialogue and communication and is built collaboratively through consensus, because when done that way, it is, first of all, the best team building. People hate that word, but team building activity an institution could take, right? I see board members emerge who've never said a word in a board meeting, I've been told, who end up taking the lead in some of these conversations during strategic planning, because it's like, oh, this is what I'm interested in, and I can contribute to this vision, and they get excited. And then the person becomes your board president in a couple of years, where you thought, I never thought this person was interested. They never say anything, right? So that process of creating institutional strategy, of working together as an organization, has benefits outside just of, how are we going to execute our mission, and a data informed approach to how we want to run this institution, and what is our vision for the next couple of years, and then what are the financial implications, and the timeline for doing that. And, this word lead, people leading, is it needs to be the board, the staff, representatives from the community, and representatives from all stakeholder groups coming together to go through this hard work of conversation of what do we want to be, informed by this current moment, listening to our community, and then saying, okay, we're going to do this, and we're all going to lead this out together, and we are all responsible for this. Right? And we're all going to talk to our respective communities about why this work is important, and we've made this decision. You may get beat up in the press for it, but if that's the decision you made together and you think it's right, and it's based in data, and it's right for your community, then take that risk and go forward. So, I think it's got to be, again, every museum has a different type of mission, works in a different way, is in a different location, has a different audience, has a different history. right? Putting aside founder-led museums where the founders are transitioning out, that's a whole other set of challenges. Is how do you honor that legacy while also move forward in a way that responds to contemporary life and sets the stage for not only how are we going to work now, but what is our vision for the next 20, 40 years, right? That honors that founder. So that's a whole nother situation. But the leading part, I think, is crucial, and the curatorial part and the shaping the story and contextualizing, and not just putting it all on one curator or curatorial team, right? This is everyone at the organization making these decisions. Again, the boards, the staff, and it redefines the role of the board in a lot of ways, right? It redefines the role of the board from just a fiduciary oversight body to, again, and this pairs with what next generations want to do, which is we want to get involved. We want to roll up our sleeves and get involved, and so take advantage of that across the board. And it's a new exciting thing a board can step into and leaders can step into. But I think that leading part is crucial, and it's how do you do it? And I think as long as these strategies are built in a collaborative way, they're consensus built through a process of listening and dialogue. You flip the switch, you take the risk, you go, and you're all in it together.
Well, Melissa,
I've been
in this world where everybody's striving to link the art that they promote to some sort of cause or impact or what have you, like who loses in that scenario? What kind of art takes a back seat if everybody is trying to link up what they exhibit to climate change or to social justice issues? There's got to be art for art's sake. Sometimes it doesn't always have to have a profound message. Does art like that take a back seat? Do museums who just want to focus on pop art or whatever, do they find themselves struggling to raise funds in an environment where everybody's looking trying to measure the impact of a museum or things like that? Like who struggles the most in a situation like we have?
Well, going back to there's no cure-all, right? You can't just show, let's break this down very, very simply, right? You can't just show a photographer who shows pictures of the polluted oceans and say, we're helping solve climate change, right? Because we're showing you how bad this is. And that's all you're going to do. That's exhausting. And that is so not all of what we can do, right? So, I don't think anything should take a back seat. And, this is my view as someone that, grew up studying art history, but is very much not a curator, right? Is every artwork was made at a certain time and reflects that individual's experience in the world, right? And I mentioned the Impressionist show that's I think it's at the National Gallery right now, right? Responding to a current moment, even if it's not overtly political or a commentary about the time we're in, we live in this time and place, right? We are human beings going through a human experience in this time and place. And the manifestation of that as a work of art, it's why we study art, why we study history through the lens of art, because it speaks to the individual's experience in that time and place. And so I kind of reject the idea that there's political art and art of social commentary, and then there's all the pretty stuff we like to put on our walls, right? I think there's everything, but everything speaks to that maker's experience in that time and place, right? And if it's a work that is purely about form and is purely in response to an art historical moment, well, it's their response to that in that time and place, right? What do we know more about that form of the technology now that we didn't know before? I mean, you can get into this work, and I think in a number of different respects. And again, I'm not a curator. I'm not a specialist. That's not the direction I went with my art history degree. I went into a different direction. But I think there are some really exceptional arts leaders and curatorial leaders right now who are looking at that and looking at things differently. And I think that's what's really great about the moment that we're in. And it's not going to be over, because again, being a place where people want to come into contact with objects or ideas or other people or theories that are going to just make you think differently, right? Make you think differently and reconsider your place in this crazy fucking world we live in, right? So what fits within the mission and the community needs, and what fits within the program that you and your organization have decided to build? What is most relevant from a curatorial standpoint? Do the forces and the trends in the market get involved in that for any reason? Those are not conversations I am capable of answering, but I definitely, I don't want to go see a show of photographs of garbage in the water, right? That's just, I know, I get it. It's awful. It's awful. Plus I see it. I got off social media because I was like, I can't see any more of all of this stuff that's going on, and political takes, and this is, Instagram has become something completely different. I just want to see how my friend's doing with her new baby in Chicago, like it's not that anymore. But, that's a decision that needs to be made by people who are much more experienced at that than me. But I don't think there's the cure-all. And I think by the nature, and it kind of goes back to what I was saying, which is art and education can get you in any conversation. There's so many different conversations you can have, and so many different works you can show that would create a conversation or make people think, challenge people, make them happy. I mean, there's also that, right? Like, sometimes we just want to go walk and see things that make us happy through the medium and the message, right? That is something that I think we could all use a little bit of at the end of October 2024.
It's funny that you say that. A few episodes ago, we interviewed a street artist named Finch, and he said that, he paints like honey bears, cute honey bears with different outfits on and all these things. They're very, he's very, very successful with this work. And he said, he feels like there's a war on happiness. And that, everybody is always saying, like pushing that, oh, your art needs to have this message, it needs to have this. And he said, no, sometimes you just want to make something that puts a smile on someone's face, that they're walking by it and it just brightens their day a little bit. Like, is that so bad? Does it always have to be so on the nose about whatever it is that you're trying to, like, help or whatever? And so, he thinks of himself as one of the handful of artists right now, just making happy work that, is really just, intended to please a little bit, as opposed to hit you over the head with some kind of message.
And that's so great. And it's also museums as gathering place. Like, what do you want to do on Friday night? I don't know. Our local museum is having an opening and there's a musician playing, and like, let's just go and be happy. And then I go engage with art, or I meet with people I've never met before. I get to know new people. I make a new friend. I make a new business connection. Like, we're also these gathering spaces that can create, be a place that creates dialogue and connection and happiness, or to challenge each other, right? You might see a show and you're talking to someone, oh, I feel this way, I'm having this response, I'm having this, and then it leads you to a conversation where you potentially challenge each other and you learn. But that can be, you walk away kind of being like, that experience kind of got me going. There's some joy and happiness in that. And I think the art industry can take itself very, very seriously, and we can't always take ourselves so seriously. And the rest of the I think the general public looks at this industry. In fact, I know anecdotally and through research that they look at us and think we're a little self-serious and opaque. And I hear a lot, it's only for people who wear all black, as I'm wearing all black, who have really cool glasses and stand around with champagne and this. Yeah. There's a reason people feel that way. And sometimes we need to just sort of laugh at that and then think about, how can we open ourselves up? Let's look at some gummy bears and some teddy bears. That would be fun.
Matisse did say that art should be like an armchair for the tired businessman. So
there you go.
I got one other relatively tough question before we get into the more opinion section, although we've had plenty of opinions so far.
Yeah.
So you mentioned at the top that a lot of the work that you've been doing recently with new chief development officers and new leaders, predominantly women. Why, on the one hand, do you think that these roles are drawing predominantly from the ranks of women and not men? And what challenges face those development offices or those institutions when you have development teams or an idea of the development industry as predominantly a female-led and female-oriented one versus one that seems to be more mixed in terms of men and women?
See, that's another 3-hour conversation.
5 minutes, go.
I just caught up yesterday, The Daily, the podcast. I'm a podcast fanatic. So thank you for having me on another one. The Daily had their episode from the New York Times podcast that looked into the gender differences in this election. And there was a really great article written about it that I think everyone should read because it really breaks down something I mentioned earlier with the researcher Richard Reeves, who's kind of one of the most recognized guys doing this now, looking into how have recent and current events and politics and technology and education and wealth disparity shaped generations of women, rising generations of women, and rising generations of men. So there's a lot of reasons why I think there are a lot of female museum leaders now. I think it's a wonderful thing to have diversity, and I think of as things you can see and things you cannot see. So we want diversity across all levels because it makes us better at what we do. I think in terms of the development teams, you mentioned something interesting, and I'm just sitting here thinking back on the development offices that I have worked in and that I advise. And I would say just anecdotally, primarily women, and therefore, a set of relationships and dynamics that might be specific to them being made up of women. I can't answer the question as to why almost all but one of the leaders I'm coaching are women. I don't know. Maybe because I am a woman and that's why they were interested in working with me. I don't know. That has never implicitly come up, but I do think about it and I do notice it. And maybe in a few years, I'll have a better answer as to why. I think there is, in terms of the female leaders, specifically in the development departments that I'm working with, whose jobs are both creating a team that can accomplish the work. They're working on what is the budget and what are the goals supposed to be, what is necessary to fund this institution. They're also that co-chief strategist with the CEO. They're the board liaison for the institution. They are the major gift donor liaison. I mean, it is such a hard job, and it's so nuanced, and it is evolving from someone who is just about raising money to being an ambassador for the institution, an advocate, but also that fellow chief strategist with the CEO, because you can't do anything unless you can fund it. And there's an understanding of board dynamics. I always thought of the president's cabinet, right? Who sits around the table, the CFO, the CDO, the marketing officer, that the chief fundraiser is kind of the secretary of state, the chief diplomat, has to be like, okay, you want to do this, but what I'm hearing from our donors, our audiences, our communities, our members, our membership base, is that they don't really want that, and that'll come off this way. So how do we and then we have this big funder. So where do we meet in the middle? How do we build consensus on this? I see the women I work with who have that role thinking about that very seriously in a very nuanced way, in addition to how do I help my staff grow? How do I find, how can I help individuals on my team grow into roles here? How do they want to grow? And I encourage those leaders to sit and really get to know their teams, not just what is their learning style, their work style, their communication style, but how do they want to grow and evolve, and how can the institution be a place where they can do that? Because we do know development people leave after 12 to 18 months on average at a job. I mean, the statistics are dire because this work is so hard and complicated and changing. So I don't know the answer to that, and it's way above my pay grade to know why there are more women in those roles. But I'm so as a woman so unbelievably impressed with the seriousness, the consideration, the generosity that they all bring to those roles, and the folks that I'm working on, including the gentleman I work with as well. That there is a very keen and serious and dedicated responsibility to making the teams happy and fulfilled and function, because they know that's how teams are going to produce the best results and work in the best way on behalf of the institution, and also a very keen, awareness of how to work with board dynamics. So I think it's interesting. It's a lot. It's a lot of work, which is why it's great to, work with an external partner and who can bring those best practices and different techniques to the table. And I learn, I have to say, I learn so much from the folks that I work with and in everything that I do, that I feel like I'm the lucky one to be able to do this work.
Melissa, I have one more question before we go to the final segment, our more opinion segment. Why have you incorporated wellness into executive coaching?
It wasn't even a decision. It was just intuitive, and it happened because, I personally went through training since the pandemic on somatic practices, so yoga, pranayama, meditation, and it just kind of birthed itself and felt right to me from the experiences that I've had, the studying and the education I have in coaching, the mentors that I've worked with, who have brought some of this to the table for me, and I've seen it work. And I see it when I work with folks in a non-executive coaching, but just, let me give you the example of a private yoga class, right? When I'm working with someone and you literally see in their body how it changes when they breathe, how they speak differently when they breathe, how they perceive the world around them differently when they breathe. And what is breath doing? It is regulating your body and helping you become present. And when you are present, you are able to make the best decisions because you see the world clearly around you. You are able to differentiate between what's your shit and what's actually happening, right? The reason we call this a practice in the wellness community is because you're never good at it. You've never accomplished it. You're never perfect. It is ongoing that you have to do this because the world around us is set up to distract us from being present, right? Increasingly so. So they go hand in hand, and there's a lot of leadership styles and research and practices into this, that when you are tasked with being the leader of an organization, everything you say and everything you do has consequences. So you want to be thoughtful, you want to be present, you want to be aware, you want to be able to, again, work with teams, work with staff, with board, with audiences, and be able to listen, right? And so it just felt very natural to me that would be part of the individual work. But then we get to the organizational wellness, right? So what is organizational wellness? I think it's when every individual there feels confident enough to do the work ahead of them. And what creates that? That cultivation of presence, being able to work well together, to co-regulate as a team, right? To create an environment of honesty and transparency, to make everyone feel safe. And in order to do that as a leader, you have to have done that for yourself. And there's no way to take on the challenges that lie ahead, as we've touched upon here with what is happening with the industry in terms of staff turnover, dissatisfaction. We can cite tons of studies, including museums moving forward, their research about how staff members of institutions feel about their pay grade, their ability to move up, the diversity in the workplace. Do they feel safe and heard? We have that going on that we need to make better, right? We have a philanthropic problem, right, where we're just of the pie of overall charitable giving in the U.S. That whole pie, our slice of the pie is 4%, arts, culture, and humanities, and it's stayed at roughly 4% for so long. We need a bigger piece of that pie. There is, over $500 billion being contributed to American charities every year, and we only get 4%. And 4% is a lot. It's upwards of 20 billion, but it's not enough to do what we can do and what we want to do. And so the focus on growing that pie is, again, going out, engaging with our audiences, continuously doing that development work. In order to do all of that, we have to be healthy, we have to be well, we have to work together as teams, And I think that starts with the individual, and it starts with the leader. And so it can get really really kind of obvious. And sometimes I'll get on the phone with a client, and something has happened and we're spinning. So it's like, okay, we're just gonna breathe. We're just gonna breathe for a little bit. I'm gonna lead you through an exercise, and then everything has changed. I feel it on the other end of the phone, and now we can get into it, right? And now you're looking at it from a different point of view. So that's a very literal way of doing it, but it's also the continuous cultivation of, are you present enough and grounded enough to be able to evaluate everything that we have to evaluate, and edit everything that we're doing in order to strategize properly and to lead teams through this moment that we're in. So it was not something I really did by saying I want to do that. It just was part of my practice and came out naturally. And I've seen it work in a number of situations, and I think it's ultimately kind of I'm a proponent of, that's what we all need to do in the world, right? Is just put the phone down, turn off all the stuff, all the technology, and just take a second, tune it out, get yourself back to center, get yourself aligned with who you are. Take a minute, have a glass of water, do some breathing. You can get back to the computer, you can get back to the Instagram, you can get back to the Slack, you can get back to all that stuff. You can refresh the New York Times and polls of what's going on, like you'll get there. But are you taking that minute to take care of yourself? And it's more important for leaders now than it ever was because of the state of the world that we're in.
I think it's especially true if you're using Slack. You probably need to meditate or something, because I hate using Slack. And
it's a weird tool, isn't it? Do you guys use it right now?
No,
or have you used it? Yeah.
I pretty much refuse. I hate it.
I refuse too. I don't understand. I don't understand why we need all these different systems that ultimately do the same thing, which is just get us to talk. But that's, again, a whole different podcast.
I've got both handymen and sirens going on. Jonathan, do you know our three more opinions question? Can you lead that one?
Sure, I can lead it. I've also got someone ringing my front doorbell, but they can wait. It's hilarious. So first, Melissa, for our more opinion segment, 3 questions. If someone gave you $10 million, a $10 million budget right now to work on a new project, different project from the consulting work and philanthropic work that you're doing, what new entity, mission, organization, company would you want to start?
We need a policy body for the arts in this country. I would try to pour that into a policy think tank with a lobbying arm, with an advocacy arm, with a marketing arm. When we founded the Arts Funders Forum in 2017, it was in response to then President Trump's inauguration and his announcement that he was going to abolish the NEA. And so the question became, if public funding for the arts goes away, is there a mechanism to spur more private giving to the arts, especially in the context of this largest intergenerational wealth transfer that's ever happened? And we looked around the room and we acknowledged the amazing work of Americans for the Arts, grant makers for the arts. And we thought, is there space there to specifically target and do research in and discuss the potential of next gen giving? So we created the Arts Funders Forum, and COVID did what it did, and we had a plan to do some very, very strong advocacy through new media that we will eventually love to bring back. But I was thinking about this with all these shows on streaming shows of these art contests, right? And they all end up being decorators who are decorating something, who decorated the best, I guess. I haven't really invested a lot of time in watching, but we have these media arms. We have these new media arms of Netflix and Amazon and what have you. And through a policy mandate, can we work with these giants to actually help clarify and articulate what this industry is in inventive, fun, and interesting ways? I don't know what that looks like. Maybe it's Brad Pitt going to artist studios and Brad Pitt sitting in on board meetings of museums when they're figuring out their budget and the shortfall because someone didn't give a gift that year. And, I don't know what that looks like, but I think $10 million is a start, and it's not going to accomplish all of it, but as a start to create a more robust policy entity to help the American public understand why the arts are important, our business model, make them interesting and sexy, and explain how they drive impact in in a variety of different areas, right? Um, that is what I would want to do with $10 million, is
Interesting.
start that, because we need to
Brett,
start at the top. We need to start at the top, and that needs to come down. We can't fund something that's necessarily just chugging along. We need a huge policy shift. We need a huge shift in attitude in this country about the role of the arts in society, in order to spur more giving, in order for people to get engaged and be advocates and ambassadors. And so I think some sort of policy entity would do that, lobbying. Yeah, I'd go to DC and figure out who should run that.
I think
And here's $10 million,
Brad Pitt.
start it. Yeah, let's
Brad
start with
Pitt's
Brad.
Brad Pitt's agent is going to want more than 10 mil, though, I think. So
It should probably be someone younger than Brad Pitt, but that's the first name that came to mind. I don't know why.
There you go. Exactly. Timothy Chalamet.
Well, he has a production company, doesn't he? He has a production company. That's why I thought of it. That works with Netflix. There you go.
Interesting. All right. So next question. Is there another organization, initiative, company, somebody out there in the field who you want to give a shout out to, who you think is doing particularly good and interesting work? And tell us a little bit about it.
I feel like I have so many conversations, lucky enough to have conversations pretty regularly with folks like you guys, who are just rethinking how our business works, or how our business needs to work, and taking those risks and trying new models. Whether that's our mutual friend who introduced Joey to me, Shlomi Rabi, who created Greenhouse Auctions, or it's directors of institutions, unfortunately, who I can't name, but who I've worked with, who will be rolling out new governance models for their organizations, of rethinking what the board of trustees is, what leadership is, what our stakeholders could do, and challenging the notion of that one board full of folks with major gift potential, but playing around and taking risk and democratizing what that leadership could be, while still finding a way to fuel an investment financially in the organization. There are so many, and I named Shlomi, and I wish I could name this other person next time we do the podcast. We can, but I'm really inspired by the folks who are rethinking this. I mentioned the Oakland Museum. I'm working with the Kemper Museum of Art in Kansas City, and was just spent some time with them. And they have a new CEO, and sitting with their board, and they're moving from a family model to a public facing model institution. And they're just doing it. They're doing it. It's hard. This work is hard. These organizations that move from founder led, as we mentioned, to more traditional nonprofit arts organizations, going through these changes, but embracing it and taking the risk and thinking it's always been done this way. Should we still be doing it that way? Because it doesn't necessarily seem to be working. We're not bringing in more money. We're not bringing in more audience. Our attendance is not going up, has not rebounded post-COVID. And so just a shout out really to all the folks that I can and cannot name, who are out there rethinking this and doing the hard work, putting their personal reputations and on the line in their roles, and who understand that this has to happen again from a place of dialogue and a consensus built plan. I'm really optimistic based on what I've seen and the folks that I've worked with.
All right, final question. If you could steal any work of art in the world from any person or institution to have it just for yourself, not for public display, you could tell maybe friends and family that you have it, but really it's only for your own benefit and your own satisfaction, what would you take?
I only get one?
Just one.
There's a lot, but I would love to live in the Rothko Chapel.
Oh, interesting.
Actually, not live in it. Have it adjacent to my home.
Okay.
Have it adjacent to my home. I think that would be really cool to go do my breathing exercises and my coaching from the Rothko Chapel. Bring in some musicians to play. Probably activate it in exactly the same way. And I, of course, being me, I'd want to open it to the public to do that. But I think that would be pretty cool to have the Rothko Chapel next door that I could access 24 hours a day.
I like the answer. That's a big ambitious one. I like it. It's first time
Why
someone's
not?
ever taken both art and architecture to
You
combine.
gave me the option of anything I want, you know?
I kind of like the idea of just occupying the chapel, right? Like you don't
Right?
steal it, except for the fact that like you lock the doors and then you're living in it and no one else can come back in.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
they just know that there's this crazy lady living in the Rothko Chapel now who's
I'll be
like
the
keeping the
crazy
public
lady.
out.
That can be the title of this podcast. Crazy lady living in the chapel.
I love it. Perfect.
Well,
All right, Melissa.
amazing.
Thank you guys. It's really an honor and a privilege and really fun to be in dialogue with you. I appreciate it. And of all the conversations we've had today, and we'll hopefully continue to have together. And thank you for all the
Absolutely.
work that you've done and the attention you bring to artists and practitioners in our field is really important. So thank you.
Thank
For
you,
sure.
Melissa.
We
Thanks for
appreciate it
putting us
too.
in touch all those years ago.
Yeah.
All right. We'll see you next time.
Okay.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.